First up, with only 10 days to go until the U.S. risks default, U.S. President Joe Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy from opposition Republican Party resumed debt limit talks late Monday afternoon Washington time. Those talks are over. CGTN's Sean Calebs has been monitoring negotiations from the newsroom. Sean, the stalemate over the debt ceiling is creating unease here in the U.S. and, of course, abroad. Where do things stand?
Yeah, it's a very good point. It's not only here, but across seas. Well, I can tell you that it broke up about an hour ago, and the high-level meetings really followed 2 hours of discussions earlier in the day by the Democratic and Republican negotiation representatives. Now, for those people out there looking for a hint of good news after weeks of the two sides being at loggerheads, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy says the talks are headed in the right direction. Now, McCarthy held a news conference and ended about 30 minutes or so ago. The speaker says both sides want to make a deal, but he is ruling out more taxes, and he wants spending cuts for the next fiscal year. Still, McCarthy maintains talks are productive and says both sides really want an agreement despite their broad differences.
I felt we had a productive discussion. We don't have an agreement yet, but I did feel the discussion was productive in areas that we have differences of opinion. Look, we both know, we've walked through this for a long time, where our differences, we're explaining them, we're giving a give and take of what we think would be best for moving the country forward. We still will have some philosophical differences, but I felt it was productive in that manner.
Now, for weeks, talks have simply been stalled. The White House agreed to limit spending on defense and a host of critical domestic programs, but Republicans are balking at that, calling for higher military spending, but demanding significant cuts, including a sharp reduction in benefits that assist the very poor. And that demand has so far been a deal breaker for Democrats. Biden says he will not give big oil and the nation's most wealthy another tax break. Time is critical, and the race is on to raise the nation's borrowing limit. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says the debt ceiling must be elevated by the end of the week to ensure that the United States does not default on its debt. Defaulting would simply have catastrophic consequences. Among the immediate concerns, millions of jobs would be adversely affected, and interest on such big-ticket items such as home and car loans would skyrocket. Many government workers would also feel the brunt of this default. For them, getting paid and receiving their benefits would also be at risk. So why is the timing so critical right now? Well, once the House approves the measure, then it must be approved by the U.S. Senate before Biden can sign it into law. President Biden has talked about using the 14th Amendment, issuing what's called an executive order to raise the debt ceiling, but that measure is untested and could potentially collapse in the courts. Now, as part of their demands, House Republicans are demanding spending limits go back to 2022 levels and have already approved a broad 8% cut in government spending for next year. Nathan?
Thanks so much, Sean. That was a really, really good rundown. And for more on these ongoing debt ceiling talks, I'm joined by Danill Manaenkov. He's head of U.S. forecasting at RSQE, University of Michigan. Thanks for coming to join us. Sean gave us the latest there, but where do you see the actual sticking points right now and the exit ramp here? Because we're a few days away. There is a little bit of wiggle room. Yellen was sort of kind of hinting at that, but not much.
Right. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.
So, the biggest sticking point is the top line spending, and reportedly the White House is offering to keep basically discretionary spending flat for fiscal year 2024, but that's probably not going to work for Republicans because they can get to that level if they refuse to pass a budget, and we are under continuing resolution world, which basically keeps spending the same for the next year. So they want more, and that's the sticking point.
So, yeah, basically this thing has to, the budget has to be sort of reapproved every year. The debt ceiling comes up from time to time, usually in a divided Congress. Usually when you have the party that gives the debt limit a heads up. But how real, compared to other times, 2011 I think of and others, is this risk of default? And what efforts are being made for contingencies, apart from the wiggle room on the June 1st date, this X date?
Right. So if you were to look at market pricing, so like a credit default swaps for U.S. debt with a maturity of like 6 months, the current episode seems to be a lot more severe. And market implied probability of default is like orders of magnitude that it was in 2011. It's still pretty low. It's like maybe 1.5%, but in an absolute sense, it's a huge risk of default for the United States. In terms of contingency planning, the good thing about U.S. sovereign debt, it does not include any cross default provisions. So basically, it's going to be issue by issue. So
right.
a particular issue.
So what does that mean? What does that mean? It means that every different bond is on its own terms, rather. Yeah, because this is important, isn't it?
Right. If you were a smaller nation, if you default on one bond, everything else you borrowed is considered in default. So basically, if you default on one bond, you default on everything.
Right.
The United States has the privilege of not having those provisions. So it's going to be one particular bond issue which could potentially face delays in payment. And now remember that if things drag on for another couple of weeks, there will be quarterly estimated tax payments which will start rolling in between June, middle of June and later on, which could give the Treasury some breathing room for a couple of weeks.
Right.
So it's at the moment the adverse scenario is not catastrophic. It's maybe delays of some federal payments for a couple of weeks because they will have to probably prioritize interest payments as the 14th Amendment pretty much prescribes. So if they stop paying interest rate on debt, they are violating the Constitution. So they'll have to prioritize payments to retirees, which is terrible for the economy, but that's the least worst option.
Now, I just want to I'm just going to step back a little bit because, you know, the US has lectured many countries. I used to work here, on the African continent, Asian continent. You know, they used to say, you've got to pay your debts, you know, really get angry with countries that had to restructure their debts. So what's the damage so far domestically and internationally for the US reputation here?
It's pretty tough to assess. So remember, in 2011, when the debt ceiling deadline was drawing nearer, I think it was Moody's which downgraded U.S. debt from AAA to AA. But I don't remember any kind of ramification. So if the actual default happens, somebody will have to call it. It's going to have to be a international organization who's going to face plenty of pressure.
Right.
And I mean, there are contracts, but there's also the world status. So in the end of the day, even if there's a missed payment for a couple of weeks, United States remains the major global superpower, and that's what's really backing the value of its debt. So I'm not into like catastrophic scenarios. I think it will be bad to miss a payment, but I think the costs of that will not come immediately. It will be a longer-term pressure on the role of the United States dollar at the international stage.
Well, I'm sure there's a lot of finance ministries around the world wish they were the United States because they don't get away with it. How can we avoid all this again when there's divided government in Washington and we tend to get these brinkmanships? Because this is not good going forward.
Fiscal negotiations have been pretty contentious for the past, I don't know, many decades, and they always go to the brink.
Right.
The specific, the peculiar nature of debt ceiling is it makes the deadline a little bit sharper than others. I'm sure they will come up with other alternatives if debt ceiling somehow goes away. For example, if Biden administration invokes the 14th Amendment and the Supreme Court concurs that it's illegal, it's a valid use of it. There are other choke points in the budget process which could become weapons in future negotiations. So I don't think that contentiousness is going away. Either way, this debt ceiling gets settled.
So even if we solve this one, we're going to be back here in a year or two. It's great, isn't it? Thanks, Danill. I really appreciate it on that note of pessimism. Thanks so much.